August can sometimes be a very consequential month. Sometimes it can be a very quiet month with all the major decision makers on holiday. This August is turning out to be a most consequential month with the Ukrainian counteroffensive, the prosecutions in the United States of Donald Trump and his lawyers and other officials, the BRICS summit, the conflict in West Africa, all of those things coming together. But I remain of the view that the single most important event, the one that requires the greatest attention, is the war in Ukraine, because it is that war around which the entire international system has become structured ever since the conflict reached its hot phase in February of last year. And it is around this war that the various countries have been busy rearranging themselves. And I would say that the war is now starting to have a significant impact on the internal life of an increasing number of countries, both in the West and, by the way, of course, also in Russia. But let's start with the war, and let's start with the latest developments there. And the last 24 hours has been one of those tantalizing periods when there's been actually surprisingly little in the way of concrete information as to exactly what is going on. And perhaps in the most important battlefront altogether, which is the one around Kupiansk, virtually no information at all. But one senses that quite important things are happening, even if they, for the moment, remain obscured by the fog of war, which remains extremely heavy. Now, over the last 36, 48 hours, perhaps even longer than that, there appears to have been a sustained Ukrainian attempt to try to break through towards, from Orechov towards the Surovikin line and beyond, and perhaps to engage in some kind of advance towards the town of Tokmak, somewhere to the south of the Surovikin line. I've seen it suggested in some places that Ukraine and its Western allies have now largely given up, or in fact have given up, on the grander plans of the Ukrainian offensive as it was originally conceived back in the autumn of last year, a breakthrough through the Russian lines, a march to the Sea of Azov, a severing of the Russian land link to Crimea. It's now, I think, largely acknowledged that this is beyond Ukraine's ability to do, and that the hope now is, the plan now is, that in the few remaining weeks left before the autumn rains close in, the objective now should be to reach and hopefully capture the town of Tokmak, which is some 15 kilometers south of the Surovikin line and perhaps 20 kilometers south from Robotino, this village that has been contested with such intensity ever since the fighting began in the first weeks of June. And perhaps unsurprisingly, we've had more reports of another big Ukrainian attack over the last couple of days. And I've suggested in several programs that Ukraine appeared to be focused on trying to capture this village of Robotino, which is 6 kilometers south of Orechov, the major concentration area of Ukrainian troops on this part of the front lines, and which has stood in the way of further Ukrainian advances further south towards the Surovikin line and towards Tokmak, and that the Ukrainian intention was to capture this village so that it could celebrate some sort of victory on the occasion of Ukraine's Independence Day. Well, Independence Day has come and gone. There's been intense fighting for the village. There have been multiple reports that Ukraine controls half the village, Ukraine controls 2/3 of the village, Ukraine controls all of the village, and that the Russians have been pushed out, or that the village is in the grey zone. Now, it's been very difficult for me to work out exactly what is going on, other than the fact that the fighting still seems to be centred around the village. And that in itself is important because it suggests that with the village Robotino still being contested, it's really not realistic to speak of a Ukrainian advance on Tokmak or even through the Surovikin line at this point. General Milley of the United States has apparently said that Ukraine has penetrated the first line of Russia's defences. If he means by that the Surovikin line, that is simply not true. He might be referring to Robotino. He might have been sort of suggesting that Robotino had been captured. But of course, Robotino is north of the Surovikin line. It's in what Russians and Ukrainians sometimes call the grey zone. But the Russians also occasionally refer to this area, as I've recently seen, as the zone of destruction, the place where enemy forces are concentrated and engaged ahead of the major defence lines, and where the intention is to inflict upon them as much destruction as possible before they reach those defence lines. So, what is the situation with respect to Robotino? Well, yesterday, there were lots of reports, I covered them in my previous programme, about a Ukrainian offensive and in this particular area. And there was reports at one point that 83 armoured vehicles, we weren't told what sort of armoured vehicles, but one got the impression that they were mainly infantry fighting vehicles rather than tanks, were involved in this attack, and that there was said to be very, very heavy fighting indeed. And I said in my previous video that having heard these reports, I thought it highly likely that by yesterday morning, Robotino would be finally under Ukrainian control. Only it turned out otherwise. It seemed that the Russians still were holding on in the southern part of Robotino, and that they'd pushed the Ukrainians back. And there was even some reports that were claiming that the Russians had pushed the Russians out of Robotino entirely. Well, then there were more reports over the course of yesterday about more Ukrainian attacks in the Robotino area. There was reports from people like Ribar that the fighting had now reached the southern outskirts of Robotino, that the Russians were only holding on there. There were further reports that the Russians had been pushed out of Robotino entirely and had established themselves in certain trenches that had previously been built south of Robotino as part of another intermediate defence line ahead of the fortified lines further south. And then further reports began to dribble in towards the evening that the Ukrainian attack had lost momentum and that the Russians were counterattacking and were in the process of recapturing the centre of Robotino from the Ukrainians. And this morning, it seems that there is still some kind of a Russian presence in Robotino, a village of 480 people before the war. Balitsky, the acting head of the Zaporozhzhie regional government, the Russian-appointed Zaporozhzhie regional government, says that Robotino has been completely destroyed There isn't a single building left standing in this village. It is now entirely ruined. But anyway, it seems that amidst the ruins, there are Russian troops who still control parts of it. Perhaps Ukrainian troops control other parts of it. So all of these attempts by Ukraine to capture Robotino, all these efforts to do so over the last couple of days, well, they've only had very partial success. And perhaps it's worthwhile recalling at this point, that we are talking about fighting for a single village, a village of 480 people before the war. This is what the Ukrainian counteroffensive has begun, a battle not to break through to the Sea of Azov, but a battle to control small villages in the grey zone, well, the former grey zone, north of the Surovikin line. And to reiterate again, a comment made by a commentator on one of the Telegram channels that I regularly read, I believe it was Slavyangrad, he made the point that so long as Ukraine cannot get beyond a situation where it is fighting over villages, small villages, then its offensive must be deemed a failure. If the offensive, this great offensive, talked about for so long, to which billions of dollars of military equipment has been committed, to which so much training has been provided, for which so much planning has taken place, if this offensive cannot evolve beyond a battle for a few small villages ahead of the major fortified lines, then in effect it has failed. Now, having said that, there were reports from Belitsky, the acting head of the Zaporozhzhie regional government, yesterday, which did say that the Ukrainians had reached the major fortified lines. And it isn't entirely clear what he meant, but he specifically referenced in these comments the major engineering works. And he said that the Ukrainians did get there in small number of vehicles, but were completely destroyed when they finally reached there. And I think this must refer to the Surovikin line. In other words, it is not, we're not talking about the small trenches, the trenches that each side has built for itself in Robotino. Clearly, there's been some kind of Ukrainian advance which battled through all the way to the Surovikin line. And there's been some maps which have been published, which I think show the area where this has happened. It was not south of Robotino. Robotino, as I said, remains contested. It was to the east of Robotino, an area of open fields and forest plantations where Ukrainian troops have been trying to advance for several weeks, mostly with small groups of light infantry trying to wade through these dense Russian minefields and brave the Russian artillery fire in this area. But it does seem that this area, this sort of bulge in the zone of destruction, or the grey zone if you prefer, which the Ukrainians have created, is the place where some of this Ukrainian advance was launched from, the advance which did finally reach the Surovikin line. And in fact, if you look at maps of this particular area of the battlefronts, one can see that in one area of this bulge, the Surovikin line, the engineering works, as Balitsky called them, are indeed very, very close to the places where the Ukrainians have now reached. So it looks as if yesterday there was an attempt by Ukraine to launch some kind of armoured force through this bulge towards the Surovikin line to try to break through, perhaps encircle Robotino, force the Russians to withdraw, and then power on to the next line, the next layer of the Surovikin line, just beyond that. Anyway, eventually hammering on until hopefully Tokmak is reached. Only Balitsky says it failed. The Ukrainian troops who did launch this attack, according to Balitsky, were completely destroyed. So that's, it seems, the sum total of the fighting at this moment in this area. There's been less news today. One gets the sense that Ukraine has been trying to gather forces, but it's suffered appalling losses in this area in these last weeks of fighting, that all of these attempts to break through, to capture Robotino itself, to consolidate control of Robotino, to push beyond Robotino towards the Surovikin line, to break the Surovikin line, all of this so far has been unavailing. All that has happened is that Ukrainian troops are suffering extraordinarily high losses in all of these various attempts that they've been making. And there was, for a time, an article, a piece in CNN from a Ukrainian, quoting a Ukrainian military officer, which highlighted the problems. No, I should say this was one of those sort of pop-up articles that comes up in every major news channel. It's not entirely disappeared, but it's been updated and shifted around. So one could probably find the original if one looks for it. But briefly, what it said was this. It was, as I said, from an officer. He spoke about, he was somebody, Ukrainian officer. He has previously fought in the Bakhmut area. He seemed to find the fighting around Robotino and south of Orekhov even harder than the fighting in Bakhmut. He spoke about the dense Russian minefields and what a problem that was, and how many men get wounded in the mines every day. He spoke about the sky being full of drones, both Russian and Ukrainian. He complained that every movement that is made is immediately and automatically identified. He spoke about the problems the Ukrainians face from the Russian artillery. He also spoke about Russian airstrikes and spoke about how these were almost continuous, how the Russian Air Force is now in almost constant operation in the skies around Robotino, south of Orekhov, and how this is making it very difficult for the Ukrainians to make any kind of progress. And generally, the overall picture that he gave was not an especially optimistic one, though he did sort of imply that Ukraine has made some degree of progress. I suspect that, like a lot of these interviews, this particular officer, even if he was speaking anonymously, had been briefed by Ukrainian officials as to what he should say, so that he tries to speak about advances. Nonetheless, he does give overall an impression of Ukraine facing almost insurmountable obstacles as it tries to continue its advance. And the overall situation in the Robotino, Orekhov area, it's starting to look to me rather as if we are closing in on that same situation that Ukraine previously found itself facing in Piatichatki, this village on the western part of the front line, near the Dnieper River, in the Vremevka ledge, where they're unable to break through either. They seem to be essentially blocked on the Vremevka ledge. They can't advance beyond Staroy Mayorsk or Orozhainaye, and there's some suggestions now that they're trying to reorganize their advance in this area and advance in a slightly different direction. But anyway, they seem to be in pretty much every place where they've been trying to conduct their offensive, and including, of course, the Bakhmut area. They seem to essentially slowly getting bogged down, getting ground to a halt. And in the meantime, even as that is going on, there are accumulating reports that they're not just suffering now from artillery shortages. We've had weeks and months of discussion about this, but about manpower shortages as well. And there's a report that's recently appeared which says that Ukraine needs to recruit at least 10,000 men a month in order just to keep the numbers of its army up to strength. 10,000 men a month. One wonders how much training these men get before they're inducted into the army. Anyway, apparently, despite all the ferocious attempts to mobilize men, all these pictures we've seen of men being rounded up in the streets and things of that kind, that this is no longer enough, that Ukraine is not able to recruit 10,000 men a month, that the number has fallen to 9 or even 8,000 a month, and that the size of the Ukrainian military is therefore dwindling under the weight of all of the losses. These are, of course, figures, by the way, which I'm not in any conceivable form able to corroborate or confirm. Anyway, we hear that the Ukrainian military is now pressing Zelensky to order a further general mobilization. We had those reports by people like Edward Luttwak a couple of days ago saying that Ukraine needed to call out 3 million men and lever en masse. I said at the time that this was a fantastical idea, a story clearly intended to scare the Russians into agreeing to negotiate an end to the war on American terms. But anyway, the long and the short of it all is that there is now apparently going to be a new mobilization, and the number that's quoted is 200,000 men, that Ukraine is now going to try over the course of the autumn and the winter to enlist a further 200,000 men. And this is not being represented as being necessary in order to defend Ukraine from a pending Russian offensive. It is being presented as being necessary in order to enable Ukraine to renew its offensive in the spring. Now, I have to say, I have major doubts about this, about Ukraine's ability to conduct a further offensive in the spring. Apparently, the idea of an offensive in the autumn and winter, as was being discussed just a few weeks ago, Ukraine waiting until the end of the Rasputitsa before renewing its offensive in the autumn and the winter. Well, that idea, it seems, has been dropped. Now we're talking about a renewed offensive in the spring. Anyway, the idea of a renewed Ukrainian offensive in the spring seems to me wildly impractical. And we've now had an article in the Wall Street Journal which essentially says why. And again, it is drawn from our usual friends, the anonymous sources, and they all say the same thing, that there just isn't any material left in the West, in the West's arsenals, to re-equip Ukraine for a further offensive. Ukraine was given all the equipment that it needed, supposedly, for the offensive that is currently underway. There is simply nothing more that the United States and the West can give. The key paragraph in this Wall Street Journal article is the following. American advice is based on the calculation that the surge of equipment the United States has funneled to Ukraine, more than $43 billion in weaponry has been committed over the years, is enough for this offensive and is unlikely to be repeated at anywhere near the same level in 2024. We built up this mountain of steel for the counteroffensive. We can't do that again. One former US official said, it doesn't exist. Words that doesn't exist are there in the article. Now, of course, that might come as a surprise to some people, brought up on the legend of the unlimited industrial capacity of the United States, its extraordinary achievement in producing enormous amounts of war production during the Second World War. If you've been following these programs, if you've been listening to Brian Boletik's programs and watching them on the new Atlas, if you've been reading the articles by Alex Vashinin, if you've been reading a few dribs and drabs of articles which have been appearing in other places, even in The Guardian and the Financial Times and the Washington Post, none of this will be news to you. The problem the United States would be facing, the problem Ukraine would be facing if they wanted to continue the war in 2024 is not financial. As I've discussed many times, the United States has an unlimited capacity for the moment to print dollars or create dollars, certainly enough dollars to fund the war in Ukraine and to keep the economy of Ukraine ticking along at the present level, vegetative level that it exists in. The problem is not one of dollars, it is of industrial capacity. The United States simply lacks the industrial capacity to produce weapons on the scale that would be needed to replicate what has been tried and which is about to fail this year, the offensive that we have seen. And there isn't that capacity to go on doing that next year, or indeed at any point, any realistic point beyond that. So, talk of a further Ukrainian offensive, be it after the Rasputitsa in the autumn and winter of this year, or in the spring and summer of next year, is a fantasy. It is a piece of mythology behind which certain Western governments and officials and Western commentators are hiding. And of course, the Ukrainian government itself is hiding as it apparently decides to continue the war and embark upon another massive conscription program in order to fill up the numbers. So Ukrainian men, increasingly few of those, but such as they are, more Ukrainian men are going to be enlisted in this Ukrainian army, an army which has by now lost many of its best soldiers, its most efficient and capable and combat experienced and best trained soldiers, soldiers that are cadre, the soldiers and non-commissioned officers and even junior officers that Ukraine, with the help of the West, has been building up since the 2014 crisis. It's the ranks of those sort of people have been thinned practically to vanishing point, apparently, within the Ukrainian military. But they are supposedly going to be replaced with a new draft of less capable, less fit, less aggressively minded men, some of them not so young anymore, and they're going to be brought into the army, and they're going to be filling up the ranks, diluting the Ukrainian military even further in terms of its overall combat capability. But clearly this is not being done in order to pursue an offensive. Ukraine lacks the means beyond the end of this current offensive to conduct any further offensives. It's purely being done in order to prolong the war, in order to try to slow down or stop whatever big Russian offensive may be coming. Now, I have to say that is, for me, an absolutely dismal outcome. It suggests that all the murmurings about diplomatic compromises and negotiations with the Russians that have been happening behind the curtain. I've done many programs recently about all of that. But all of this is going to be taking place without any willingness to acknowledge the fact that in military terms, this war is in its essentials by now clearly lost. If Ukraine is running out of men and is having to embark on this further conscription, and if the United States itself admits that that the weapons to replace the weapons that have been lost in this offensive don't exist, and if it is acknowledged that the F-16s aren't going to make a big difference, and if it's also acknowledged that the ATACMS missiles aren't going to be provided to Ukraine in any sufficient number, and they won't make any sort of difference at all, then the lives of Ukrainian soldiers, of Ukrainian men, are being sacrificed for no other reason than to prolong the war, to help perhaps the political positions of some people in Ukraine and in the West, but ultimately, and I can't help but think this, ultimately to try to put off the evil day when there is a Ukrainian collapse beyond the presidential election in the United States next year. We see, I've said at the start that everything now that is happening around the world is connected to everything else, and that the Ukrainian war is connected to the election in the United States. We see how that now is working both ways. Ukraine has been pushed into an offensive that was ill-advised and misconceived, and which has caused it to experience enormous losses. It has gained very little territory. It has captured a small number of villages. It has been stopped in front of the big Russian fortified lines. It suffered tens of thousands of casualties in the process, but it's been forced to do that, as is now clear, by the relentless pressure it has come under from its Western sponsors, who have wanted to see a quick and victorious end to the war in order to justify the previous commitment to Ukraine that they had made and to achieve their ideological and geopolitical objectives. And now that it looks as if that offensive is going to fail, those same people who strong-armed Ukraine into this offensive in the first place are now telling Ukraine, continue the war, recruit more men, prolong it, as long as you possibly can, so that in the meantime we can see whether we can patch up something with the Russians, which will save our face, even if it means that you lose territory. Or if not, well, at least you can keep going until the presidential election in the United States is out of the way. This is what Western policy has come to. Well, I could say an awful lot more. I'd probably start becoming emotional, so I'm not going to. But anyway, that's where we are. So, no more weapons, no more men, certainly not enough men and weapons for a further offensive. Let's not indulge in that particular fantasy anymore. Ukraine, before very long, will have to go onto the defensive and think about some way of going forward and prolonging this war until something turns up, until there is a breakthrough in the diplomacy with the Russians. We'll talk about that in a moment. Or until there is a crisis in Russia. We'll talk about that too. Or until the presidential election in the United States is out of the way and the United States, or at least its leaders, can move on to something else. Now, let's just discuss what might happen if Ukraine were to decide to go onto the defensive. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in recent weeks, months, about how the war is in stalemate, how neither side can advance, how the Russian and Ukrainian forces have basically fought each other to a standstill. And I've argued in many places, as have others like Larry Johnson, for example, that this is simply wrong, that this isn't a stalemate, this is an unstable equilibrium. Russian forces are building up in strength, Ukrainian forces are growing weaker. We've just seen how the Ukrainian forces are growing weaker. And even as Ukraine is coming together, considering how to carry out a mobilization of 200,000 men, the Russians are claiming that 40,000 men are volunteering to join the Russian army every month. Now, some of that will obviously make up for the casualties that the Russians also are suffering. So this isn't a net increase of 40,000 men every month, but it is nonetheless a substantial increase. The Russians, as they've said themselves, are able at the moment to create a new regiment out of these volunteers every day. That's probably not what they're doing. They won't want to create new regiments from scratch, but gradually, steadily, the Russian army is getting bigger. We have seen further evidence of a very big surge indeed in Russian industrial production. Now, manufacturing in the second quarter of this year in Russia apparently grew by around 11%. Some of it undoubtedly is the civilian economy responding to the opportunities created by the withdrawal from the Russian market of various Western companies, which has left niches which Russian businesses are scrambling to fill. And some of it also undoubtedly is the product of the Russian government's big investment program, trying to push forward industrial expansion and construction, infrastructure construction, as it also tries to keep the economy moving forward in an era of sanctions. But some of it almost certainly is related to the war, and we're starting to see more and more evidence of this. There's been lots of talk about tanks and shells and aircraft and guns, but perhaps the most impressive evidence of this huge increase in production is the enormous increase in Russian drones that we're now seeing all over the battlefronts. Russia began the war with relatively few drones. It is now, well, flooding the sky with drones, and this production is accelerating. So we see that the Russians are increasing numbers of men, they're increasing weapons production, they're growing stronger. And if we're talking about a Ukrainian mobilization of 200,000 men over the course of the autumn and winter, well, bear in mind that Russia, at the current rate of enlisting 40,000 men a month, is probably going to match that number through these volunteers that are joining by the end of the year. And most of these, over time, will become trained men equipped with modern weapons, which, as we see increasingly, the Ukrainians will not be. And by the way, in terms of numbers of men, we've now had certain action taken by President Putin, which no doubt brings a final end, in a sense, to the Prigozhin affair. Putin has just issued a decree which essentially orders all volunteer fighters and fighters in organizations like Wagner to sign contracts with the Ministry of Defense to accept allegiance. So before, it was a voluntary thing. They could either sign contracts and participate in the war, or they could remain part of an organization like Wagner and perhaps go to places like Africa and engage there. That will not be an option any longer. They all have to sign contracts with the Russian Defense Ministry. We see that the Russians are now taking purposeful steps, now that Prigozhin has left the scene, to bring everything under central control, to tighten up control of all of these companies and militia groups that have been operating alongside the Russian military in Ukraine, and, by the way, elsewhere as well. And so this has all been brought together, and the reports suggest that large numbers of Wagner fighters are now indeed signing contracts. They were already starting to do so before this decree was published. I suspect still more of them will do so over the next few weeks. We're probably talking about an addition of another 25,000 men, maybe, trained, experienced fighters ready to join the army, probably immediately, and probably they will be deployed in all sorts of places fairly soon. And we also hear, and I discussed this yesterday, that Russian officials, Belitsky and Alaudinov, the latter a military officer, are now dropping a very heavy hints that there is going to be a big Russian offensive at some point, launched at some point over the next 30 days. To be clear, I don't think this is intended to be the knockout blow. I think that this is going to be an attempt by the Russians to resolve the various outstanding issues, to consolidate perhaps control of areas in the Bakhmut area, perhaps to push on to clear Donbass. It's possible. One doesn't know how ambitious this offensive is going to be. To regain the ground lost in Kharkiv region last year, with the advance towards Kupiansk already pointing in that direction. There have been earlier hints by other Russian officials that they're also planning to return to the West Bank, the right bank of the Dnieper in Kherson region, retake Kherson region, perhaps put themselves again in a position where they can threaten Nikolaev and Odessa ahead of what I suspect is going to be the still bigger Russian offensive in the spring. So the Russians probably have enough men and machines to do that. If Ukraine were to go on the defensive now, it would no doubt slow that sort of an offensive. If the Russians were to launch it, maybe the Russians would not achieve all of their objectives this autumn and winter, but it's likely that they would achieve some. And in the meantime, the mere fact of having to resist this Russian offensive is going to cause the Ukrainian military to suffer still more attrition, weaken it even further, even as the Russians prepare for the knockout blow, which other Russian officials, General Medvedev, for example, have hinted is going to come in the spring. So, what does Ukraine do? Now, there's been articles. There was that recent article in the National Interest that I talked about some days ago. There was an article, much more important, an insightful article by Jim Webb and George Beebe in Time magazine. They were suggesting that Ukraine urgently needs to call off this offensive. That, it seems to me, is a no-brainer, and go on the defensive. And so it should. But where should it do it? And here I think, again, there needs to be a certain element of realism starting to take hold. It's very likely, as I said, that at some point over the next few weeks, the Russians will launch some sort of an offensive. Probably not a general offensive intended to break Ukraine and end the war once and for all, but an offensive which the Russians will no doubt undertake with two purposes. Perhaps to clear Donbass, perhaps to strengthen their overall positions, perhaps, and this I think is undoubtedly the case, to cause Ukraine to experience very heavy additional attrition as they try to repel this Russian offensive, which will be backed by tanks and machines and shells and aircraft and drones in quantities that Ukraine has not been able to deploy in this offensive that it has undertaken now. And of course, if this Russian offensive is going to be launched in the next few weeks, as I said, the reports yesterday were talking about within the next 30 days, then Ukraine doesn't have the time to create big fortified lines comparable to the Surovikin line along the current line of contact to repel this offensive. It seems to me that the logical thing for Ukraine to do, if it is going to avoid attrition, is to do what that NATO official who has been in contact with me for some months now, and with whom I was recently in contact, has suggested. It is to withdraw across the Dnieper River, to the west bank of the Dnieper, cutting off the bridges and accepting that most of the territory east of the Dnieper, including much of the territory in Kharkiv region, is irretrievably lost. The alternative would be not perhaps a war fighting east of the Dnieper, which might necessarily bring the Russians to the Dnieper, but very heavy additional attrition, which Ukraine simply can't absorb. Now, the Dnieper is a potential fortified line. It would, withdrawing west of the Dnieper, would buy Ukraine more time. It would be difficult for the Russians, or so it seems to me, to just cross the Dnieper. They would have to work very, they could eventually do it, but it would take time for them to do it. And then, of course, Ukraine could use that time productively, not with the view to continuing the war, but rather to begin negotiations. And they would have to be negotiations of an entirely different type from the ones that we've been hearing so much about over the last few weeks, negotiations to sacrifice some territory in eastern Ukraine to the Russians, but to allow the rest of Ukraine to join NATO, those sort of things. It would have to be a negotiation to end the war, but one which acknowledges that Ukraine cannot become a member of NATO, probably will not be able to become a member of the European Union either, and which will have to make difficult decisions about its own internal arrangements and its future orientation with Russia. But that seems to me the military logic, trying to withstand the Russian sledgehammer east of the Dnieper is going to cause Ukraine to suffer enormous losses, which will put Ukraine in an even weaker position when an even bigger Russian offensive unrolls next spring, whereas pulling back across the Dnieper at least buys Ukraine time. Now, I would say that there's a theory that has taken hold in some places, that if Ukraine withdraws to the west bank of the Dnieper, this line, the line of the Dnieper, would not just be a new front line, it might even become Ukraine's new eastern state border. I think that this is an unwise idea, and that the people who float it don't understand human geography very well. The Dnieper is not a natural border. It is Ukraine's key transport artery. Many of Ukraine's biggest cities are located, strung out along the Dnieper. Places like Nikopol, Kryvyi Rog, Dnipro, Kremenchuk, Kiev itself. Kiev straddles the Dnieper. The part of Kiev is on the east bank of the Dnieper. Even towns that are not directly on the Dnieper, like, say, Poltava, are too close to the Dnieper to be secure if the Russians are in full control of the east bank. If Ukraine is to survive as a viable economic unit, it needs to be able to operate along the Dnieper, to send its barges and boats along the Dnieper. It needs to have access to the eastern hinterland beyond the Dnieper as well. That, of course, pulls Ukraine towards Russia. But then that is the nature of Ukraine's economic geography. If I can just give a further example, before the breakup of the Soviet Union, Kharkiv, which is now in Ukraine, and Belgorod, which is of course in Russia, formed part of a single big industrial urban conurbation. The creation of the border, the state border, split that conurbation in two. Belgorod, part of the much bigger Russian economy, has adjusted and has prospered. Kharkiv has declined. If the Dnieper becomes the new border, the rest of Ukraine, west of the Dnieper, will decline as well. It will decline very fast. And as I said, I think this isn't realistic. So I have set out all of these views. I don't think anybody in Kiev or Washington or London or Brussels or Berlin or Paris is going to pay the slightest attention to what I'm saying, even if they're listening to the programs, which perhaps some of them are. But I think these points need to be made. I think these points, these realistic points of clarity need to be made. After all, I've been saying for months now, since the conflict began, that if one has Ukraine's interests at heart, if you're really concerned about what Ukraine's best interests are, then this war should be resolved by negotiations with the Russians. Not through war, not through armed conflict, not by calling up hundreds of thousands of men, more men, to prolong the war. It's by sitting down and negotiating a compromise with the Russians, which finally understands that the Russians have legitimate security and other interests in Ukraine, which must be satisfied if this war is to be brought to an end, if Ukraine in some form is to survive, and if the peace of Europe is to be secured. None of that has happened. And if we're now in a situation where it seems to me we must face the possibility of a Ukrainian withdrawal west of the Dnieper River, it is because that course of negotiation has not been followed and Ukraine has been brought to the disastrous point at which it now is. Anyway, that's what I'm going to say about the Ukrainian conflict in this program. There's been a lot more on the Prigozhin affair. We've had comments from President Lukashenko of Belarus, and I think that they are very interesting comments indeed. And to my mind, they solidify my opinion that the Putin government was not directly involved in Prigozhin's death. And Lukashenko, of course, has said that it's completely out of character for Putin to organize Prigozhin's murder in this way. Importantly, Lukashenko did not say, he was careful to make it clear that he wasn't saying that Putin is not capable of ordering the elimination of someone who might cause, from Putin's perspective, a danger to Russia, to the internal stability of Russia. Lukashenko went out of his way to say that Putin understands and is prepared to do some pretty dirty things sometimes. That was Lukashenko's language. But Lukashenko made the point, which has been made by others, several places, by myself, by Eve Smith, by others, that doing it in this way, arranging an air crash in this fashion, killing innocent people, it's just not Putin's style. And why would he do it when it wasn't necessary? And that's Lukashenko's view, it's my view, and I think it's a very persuasive point. And bear in mind, Lukashenko knows Putin, they've known each other for years. I, of course, do not know Putin, but I've followed his actions and I've seen the way he works. But Lukashenko said something else, and it was very interesting. He said that on a recent trip to the United Arab Emirates, he received information, presumably from the Emiratis, that there was a plot to murder, to assassinate Prigozhin. And Lukashenko was sufficiently concerned about this information that he immediately passed it on to the Russian authorities. And then subsequently, Lukashenko had a meeting with Prigozhin himself, and Lukashenko asked Prigozhin, I passed on this information about a plot to assassinate you to the Russians. Did you receive that information? And Prigozhin said, yes, the Russians did indeed pass it on. So the Russians acted, in other words, to scotch a possible assassination attempt of Prigozhin. Now, of course, that doesn't conclusively prove that the Putin government wasn't involved in Prigozhin's death, but it must make it much less likely. And I would have thought that a further reason, incidentally, why the Russians would not want to arrange Prigozhin's assassination is that Lukashenko, who had established a relationship with Prigozhin and who is now a key ally of the Russians, would not have been pleased about such an assassination organised by the Russians either. So that's an interesting fact. And by the way, I would say that Lukashenko saying that he got this information from the UAE means that if he didn't, the authorities in the UAE would be able to contradict it, and it seems they haven't done so. It suggests that some of the planning to kill Prigozhin probably took place in the UAE, most probably in Dubai, which is how the UAE found out about it. And of course, in Dubai, all kinds of people meet, including people from the Russian world. It's not inconceivable that Dubai would be the location where a plan like that might be engineered, where indeed people might also meet with representatives of foreign intelligence services as well. Dubai is that kind of a place. So there was apparently some thinking about a plan, some talk of an assassination of Prigozhin. Lukashenko received a tip-off. He passed it on to the Russians. The Russians passed it on to Prigozhin. Prigozhin himself has behaved in a most extraordinary way. There's little evidence that he took any step at all to enhance his own security. In fact, over the last few weeks, he's been relatively visible in terms of his movements. And then there's that question that many people are asking, which I have no answer to, which is what were all of those Wagner people, the top Wagner people, doing, travelling in the same plane as Prigozhin himself? I don't have an explanation for that. It does seem extraordinary. And it seems almost to have been an invitation to someone to carry out some kind of an assassination attempt. I don't, as I said, know exactly what was going on, but somebody who wanted to do a decapitation strike on Wagner, well, they were given the perfect opportunity, which, as discussed, as is clear, they seized with both hands. And does perhaps narrow the circle of suspects. I would have thought that both the Russians and others will be following up now on that tip-off from the UAE. They will also be asking themselves who would have known that all of these important people from Wagner were on that plane when they were. And of course, there's also the mysteries about Prigozhin's own actions. I just want to make one point on that clear. I know there's been some rumours that this was all arranged by Prigozhin himself to conceal himself and that he'll pop up somewhere else. That's possible. I do think it is most unlikely. The possibility that Prigozhin intended to kill himself and wanted the whole of Wagner to go down with him, I think is a possibility which I have seen some suggest. I think it can be completely ruled out. I think that he was not that sort of a person at all. Anyway, that's all I wanted to say about Prigozhin. Now, the big news, the very big news that's happened is the BRICS summit, the expansion of the BRICS. And Alex Christoforou and I had the privilege of doing a program yesterday with Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who was discussing the outcome of the BRICS summit and also China's economic slowdown and he was making some comparisons with the slowdown that Japan experienced in the 1980s. I should say that I've had some comments from some people, including one particular person who is extremely well informed about these matters and whose views I take extremely seriously, that challenges some of Professor Sachs's views about Japan's economic decline in the 1980s and, by extension, China's problems today. I'm not going to get into that discussion in this program. But what I will say is this. Putting all that aside, and it is an important and interesting topic in itself, and I'm not judging who's right or who's wrong about this because, well, it's something that I don't have the specialist knowledge to comment usefully about. But putting all that aside, the key thing to understand about the BRICS, the latest BRICS summit, is that what we're seeing is a new international trading system, distinct from that controlled by the West, being set up. And Professor Sachs used the extremely interesting word, workaround, that various countries now want to work around the dollar. The dollar, and not just the dollar, but the entire Western trading system. And I think this is indisputable. I think ultimately this is what this is all about. Now, it ought to be said that the United States has had a policy of trying to contain countries that it sees as economic and commercial rivals. It certainly did do this to an extreme degree with the Soviet Union after the Second World War. I remember that during the period known as détente in the 1970s, the Soviets were very keen to establish normal trading relations with the United States. There was talk, by the way, that the Soviets wanted to move towards an export-led economy, exporting manufactured goods. Most people I know are completely unaware of the fact that they'd entered into very detailed discussions with Lockheed about building Lockheed TriStars in this wide-bodied jet at that time in a factory in Voronezh, which were going to be exported to all sorts of places around the world. The Soviets were keen at that time to integrate themselves fully in the Western economy. Of course, the United States saw the Soviet Union as a potential industrial rival and as a geopolitical adversary. And after some consideration of this idea, in the 1970s, basically the barriers went up again. And one can debate what happened with Japan in the 1980s, but there's no doubt at all that Japan came under a great deal of economic pressure from the United States during that period, as I remember from myself. And recently, in the last few years, we've seen the same thing happen with China. The United States is now purposefully acting to prevent China's economic development. We can see this happening on an increasing, evolving scale. It's trying to block exports of high technology goods to China. It's imposing tariffs on Chinese trade. It's trying to put pressure on American businesses to disinvest from China. It's trying to block investment in China. And, of course, all of this coming on top of the massive attack on Russian trading systems, the destruction of the Nord Stream pipelines, the massive sanctions on Russia, the ousting of Russia from the dollar system, the seizure of Russia's central bank reserves, or at least the attempted seizure of Russia's central bank reserves. And so what is happening is that more and more countries, China, Russia, India, all of these others, are saying to themselves, this is impossible. We cannot hope now to trade on equitable terms with the United States. We cannot use the systems that the United States created in the 1940s at Bretton Woods with the other Western powers, and which have formed the bedrock of the international trading and currency system. What we must do instead is build our own alternatives, not so much in order to overthrow the dollar, but simply so that we can trade effectively with each other, building up our economies, develop markets with each other, create trade patterns with each other, distinct from those ultimately controlled by the United States, which will not expose us to the kind of strangulation pressures that the United States has exerted and is now again trying to exert as it tries to maintain its overall paramountcy over the global economic system. Now, Western response to the decisions made at this BRICS summit has been, to put it mildly, negative. There's been some furious comments I've noticed in particular about Brazil. There's comments about how President Lula of Brazil has somehow let the side down by aligning Brazil with the supposedly criminal regimes of China and Russia. Been some astonishing comments, especially coming out of some people in Germany, which I'm not going to repeat because, to be frank, I find them so over the top that I don't think it's proper simply to repeat the kind of language that's being used. But the other comments that one has seen is the usual complacent comments from all kinds of people that this is impossible, setting up a separate, distinct trading system from that of the West is unachievable. And there's a long editorial in the Financial Times to that effect today, and it ends with this paragraph: the BRICS may grow, but it is unlikely to achieve much. Plenty of talk, little action, not too different then from some business meetings. Complacency, dripping with complacency, condescension, and not a little arrogance, if I may say, with a peculiarly ill-favoured joke. Little action, including all these new countries, sending out invitations to all of these new countries, talk about setting up financial and trading systems. Little action might not be ultimately successful action, but I can't see how this can be said to be little action. But anyway, there we are. So, are these doubters correct? Well, only time will tell. But Professor Sachs, in that program we did with him on the Duran yesterday, has pointed out that, in fact, the technical obstacles in terms of setting up financial systems, the kind of financial trading systems, are not insuperable by any means. That there are all kinds of things that can be done. What it requires are able technocrats and strong institutions. And the one thing that the Russians, the Chinese, the Indians, the others too, are not short of is able technocrats. They can do it. It may take them time. I've seen some suggest that it will take them 5 to 10 years before all of these structures have been fully perfected. But it doesn't mean that we can't see the thing starting to operate to some extent, at least in the meantime, and exerting growing influence as well. And on top of that, it should be pointed out that expectations that this summit would be a failure were very widespread in the media before, suggested that China and India were going to be at odds. Turns out that India is fully on board with all of these ideas. And of course, President Xi Jinping and Prime Minister Modi had a meeting in which they appear to have agreed to work harder to diffuse the tensions between them and to try to find some kind of way of easing the tensions on their common border, which have been the long-running problem, which has kept these two great nations at odds with each other. So, it's not impossible. It can be done. And Professor Sachs made the further point, which is that over and above my comments in my programme yesterday, that there'd clearly been some degree of horse trading as to who the new states that would join BRICS would be. All have agreed about the Persian Gulf states, Saudi Arabia, Iran and the UAE, but clearly the Russians were keen on Egypt, the Chinese were keen on Ethiopia, the Brazilians wanted Argentina. Probably before long, by the way, I'm going to guess Indonesia will be offered a lot. We might see a new wave of BRICS countries joining the BRICS in the future. Indonesia, Vietnam, perhaps Cuba, perhaps Angola, those kind of states. Anyway, put all that aside. Even as all this is going on, as I said, attempts in the West to pretend that it's not happening, even as we see it happen. I'm going to make one general observation. I think it is probably true in the long term that the world can't have two separate trading systems. The world has operated essentially as a single trading unit since arguably the 16th century. Dividing it up, fracturing it, is really not realistic. When attempts have been made to do so, what eventually happens is that the dominant trading system ultimately absorbs whatever rivals have been set up to itself. To my mind, one way of understanding the collapse of the former Soviet bloc is to understand that that was what happened. The Soviets did try and set up their own trading system amongst their allies through the so-called Council of Mutual Economic Assistance and with the transferable ruble, in rivalry to that of the West, but it was on a minuscule scale compared to that of the West. All of the members of the former Soviet bloc ultimately felt that they needed to trade with the Western economies, and that included the Soviet Union itself, and that set in train a series of processes which led to that bloc completely disappearing. And I can't help but think that sooner or later the same will happen. We have a Western bloc, still led by the United States, using the dollar, built around the World Trade Organization, the IMF, the World Bank, the old system set up in the 1940s, and then we have the BRICS system in rivalry to it. Sooner or later, one of these will prevail and will absorb the other. The question is, which one? Now, I would put my money for the moment on the BRICS. And the reason I do that is because, well, unlike the situation in the past, they are the biggest producers and traders in real goods. The West used to have that position. It had that position throughout the Cold War. That is why the Soviet bloc was never ultimately an effective rival, and that is why the Soviet bloc failed and why the Western bloc prevailed. Now it is the other way round. It is the Chinese, the Indians, the Russians, the Persian Gulf states. They are the people who produce and make things and who sell real goods and trade them with each other. Now, that's a general point. Of course, it's also true that for the moment at least, this alternative system comes without the political baggage that the Western system does. I'm going to suggest that the great story in the world, the thing that's really going to shape events over the next 10, 20, 30 years, will be the struggle between these two emerging economic blocs. Which one of them prevails in the end will be the one that decides the course of future history. And once more, it's essential to say that the catalyst for this event, the single thing that has moved the process, the dial of the process, further and faster than it might either otherwise have gone, that has been the war in Ukraine and the way in which the United States has operated it. So that's what I wanted to say about these momentous events that we are seeing. We are unquestionably at a pivot moment in world history, or so it seems to me. But moving away from these great events, we will see how things develop on the battlefields in Ukraine over the next few days and weeks, what further steps are taken, what happens in West Africa, where ECOWAS has apparently put a force of 12,000 men together in order to try to occupy Niger. That might not be enough, by the way. And we'll see whether the Chinese and the Indians are indeed able to sort out their problems with each other. But this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Have a very good day. Just to remind you once more, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. And don't forget to go to our shop. You can buy the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all those great things. And last but not least, let me wish you a very good day and remind you that you can support, that if you've liked this video, you can indicate that by pressing the like button and checking your subscription to this channel. More from me soon. Have a very good day and enjoy your weekend.